The vibration didn't start in the air. It started in the soles of my shoes, traveling up through 3 inches of poured concrete that had no business moving at all. I felt it before I heard it, the way I'd felt it 100 times in a country I never talked about. Nobody at Brookhaven Regional knew anything about my past. Not my coworkers, not my supervisor, not the man who'd hired me off a 6-line resume that said almost nothing. They just knew I didn't talk. Then, 11 hours later, 4 men in tactical gear put their shoulders into the east entrance and tore the doors off their hinges, calling out a name nobody in that building had ever heard. Wraith. But that's the end of the story. Let me take you back to where it actually started, to a Tuesday no different from any other, except for everything that was coming. My name on the ID badge was Marin Cole, Run, Night Shift Trauma Float. I'd worked Brookhaven for 2 years, and most of the staff still weren't sure which unit I officially belonged to, which was exactly how I'd engineered it. I picked up the shifts nobody wanted. Overnight, holidays. The dead Tuesday hours between midnight and dawn, when a hospital runs on caffeine and momentum, and not much else. Brookhaven smelled the way every ER smells once you stop noticing it consciously. Bleach laid over old coffee. The chemical sweetness of hand sanitizer dispensed 40 times an hour. The underlying copper note that never fully leaves a trauma bay, no matter how hard housekeeping scrubs. The lights buzzed at a pitch that gave the day's shift residents headaches by hour 8. Gurney wheels squeaked against linoleum in a rhythm I could have narrated blind. To the rest of the staff, the overnight surge felt like drowning. To me, it felt like Tuesday. I moved through the chaos the way I moved through everything. Economical, unbothered, hands that never shook even when the code alarms went off loud enough to rattle the ceiling tiles. I found collapsed veins by feel before I ever looked at them. I clocked every exit and every angle of approach in a room within seconds of walking into it, an old habit that had outlived the reason I developed it. Nobody else at Brookhaven noticed the supply room door that didn't latch all the way, or the fact that I always stood with my back to the nearest wall, never the open room. I noticed everything. I always had. I kept a single photograph folded into my badge holder where nobody would think to look. 8 men in desert tan, squinting into a sun that had tried to kill every one of us at least once. I never looked at it during a shift. I didn't need to. I knew exactly which faces were missing from it now, and some math you just carry instead of solving. And then there were nights, rarer now, when the overhead vents kicked on with a particular low growl that sounded enough like distant rotors that my whole body went still for half a second before my brain caught up with where I actually was. Dr. Preston Ashford ran Brookhaven's emergency department like a man who'd never once been told no and intended to keep it that way. Sharp suited under his white coat, the kind of confidence that came from connections rather than scar tissue. He was competent in the narrow way ambitious people often are, good with the textbook cases, lost the moment anything refused to follow the protocol. That night, Bay 6 had Earl Whitlow, 73, a Vietnam veteran brought in with chest pain the triage resident had written off as anxiety. I'd taken his vitals myself. His pressure was climbing. His pain was radiating into his jaw, and the AD strip in my hand told a story nobody had bothered to read closely. I flagged it to Ashford directly. "I've got board certification, and you've got a community nursing license," he said, loud enough for the whole station to hear, snatching the strip out of my hand without looking at it. "Stick to vitals and let the people with actual medical degrees make the calls." I had a bachelor's degree, a decade of trauma medicine he knew nothing about, and a dying man's chest pain sitting unaddressed 2 bays away, but I said none of it. "His troponins pending and his pain pattern is classic," I said. "You'll want to repeat AG in 15 minutes. Nothing else." My hands stayed perfectly still at my sides, though something underneath them tightened and had to be talked back down. Ashford didn't answer. He walked off with my strip still in his hand. Nobody at that station said a word on my behalf. Nobody ever did. I went back to my charting, because Earl needed someone watching his monitor even if it wasn't going to be the director. I took my break in the supply closet because the lock actually worked and nobody else wanted the smell of expired sailing bags. 4 minutes, usually, sometimes 5, if the world was being kind. I had been a Navy corpsman once, the only Medic 3 platoons trusted enough to request by name. My call sign was Wraith, because I could move through a building or a kill house without anyone in it knowing I'd been there until it was already over. Ramadi took something out of me that I never got back, not all of it. 8 men under my hands in a single deployment. 6 of them walked away breathing because of decisions I made in under 10 seconds, and 2 of them didn't. And I have never once stopped running that second number through my head at 3 in the morning. I didn't leave because I broke. I left because I knew exactly how close I'd come to breaking, and I respected that line enough not to cross it twice. Civilian medicine, anonymous shifts. A city where nobody knew my name or my number, that was the math that let me keep getting out of bed every day. It wasn't hiding. It was survival, with better paperwork. I believed that completely, every single day, until the night the math stopped adding up the way I needed it to. 20 minutes later, the repeat AKE came back exactly the way I knew it would. An evolving heart attack, the kind that kills quietly if nobody's paying attention. Ashford ordered the cath lab activated, took full credit for catching it in his note, and found a spare minute to remind me of my place anyway. "Next time you think you've spotted something," he said, "run it up the chain instead of acting like you're qualified to interpret it yourself." He said it loud, for an audience of exactly nobody who mattered, the particular performance of a man who needed witnesses to feel important. He had no idea the float nurse he'd just lectured had once made faster, harder calls than that, with bullets actually moving through the air around her, in a city he couldn't have located on a map if his license depended on it. I swallowed it. It tasted the way it always did. "Understood, Doctor," I said, and went to sit with Earl while he waited for transport, because somebody needed to. He gripped my hand with surprising strength for a man with an MI in progress. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't a question. Not the nursing. The other thing. I told him I didn't know what he meant, and he just smiled like he'd already known the answer before he asked. "Whatever it was," he said, "thank you for your service." I didn't correct him. Some debts you let people pay even when they're paying the wrong account. And then, underneath the routine chaos, something in the building had already begun to shift, though I had no way of knowing it yet. A stillness, the particular quiet right before a night, decides what kind of night it's actually going to be. The vibration came back, stronger this time, climbing up through the floor until I felt it in my jaw. I knew the signature before I consciously placed it, an MH-60M Black Hawk. Low, fast, carrying weight it wasn't built to carry comfortably. Then the radio at the desk erupted. Mass casualty inbound. Training accident at the Naval Special Warfare Center. Vehicle rollover. Multiple injured. 1 critical. ETA, 4 minutes. 4 minutes is nothing. 4 minutes is also everything, depending on what you know how to do with it. The department dissolved into the particular chaos of people who'd trained for strokes and overdoses, and never for this. A resident knocked over a crash cart trying to clear space. Someone shouted for security to lock down the bay doors per mass casualty protocol, and somewhere a supervisor was already on the phone demanding clarification nobody had time to give. Ashford planted himself in the middle of it, shouting instructions that were technically sound and completely useless against what was about to come through those doors. And then they wheeled the critical patient in running. A SEAL, late 20s. His lower face and airway crushed in the rollover, blood and swelling closing off what was left of his throat by the second, his oxygen already dropping past the number where brains start dying. Severe maxillofacial trauma with a closing airway. I knew exactly what that needed, and exactly how few seconds it gave anyone holding the wrong tools. No civilian ER team in that building had ever cut an airway into a man's throat outside of a simulation lab, and somewhere behind that gurney a second wave of radio traffic was already warning of more vehicles, more injured. The start of something bigger than one patient. I pressed my back into the supply room wall and stayed there. My hands had started shaking, for the first time in 2 years, for the first time since Ramadi. Not here, I told myself. Not my problem anymore. I watched the resident try and fail to get a tube past swelling that had already closed the path. I watched the kid's oxygen number drop into a range I knew the cost of by heart. I told myself someone else would handle it. I almost believed that, too, Ashford spotted me near the doorway and waved me off without breaking his rhythm. Not now, go restock 6. A security officer, following lockdown protocol to the letter, steered me firmly toward the corridor. I went. I stood in the hallway and listened. The oxygen alarm changed its pitch, the one that means seconds, not minutes. Someone called for a surgical airway kit nobody on that team had ever actually used. The kid's heart rate began climbing toward the number where things stopped being reversible. I listened to a young man's last working minutes happening 40 feet away while I stood in a hallway doing absolutely nothing. Short sentences. That's all I had left in me by then. I made my decision against the cold tile in under 3 seconds. Then I moved. The locked east doors held for exactly as long as it took 4 men to decide they weren't going to hold any longer. I heard the first hit, metal on metal. Controlled, violent, and then the second one tore the frame loose entirely, glass scattering across the tile like something out of a different kind of building altogether. 4 men in tactical gear came through the gap in a tight, practiced line, rifles slung low but unmistakably present, moving with an economy that made the security officer near the desk step back without anyone telling him to. The lead man was solid through the shoulders, younger than I expected. A face that triggered something in me I hadn't let surface in 2 years. Master Chief Reyes. He'd been a second-class petty officer the last time I'd patched a hole in his shoulder by headlamp. Ashford intercepted them, puffed up with an authority that had never once been tested against anything real. You cannot just break into a secured medical facility. Reyes didn't slow down. Move, he said. And then Ashford's whole posture folded against 4 men who had never once needed a hospital director's permission for anything that mattered. They weren't asking for the attending. They weren't asking for a chart. Reyes swept the room once, fast, trained, the exact way I'd once taught junior corpsmen to read a space for threats and exits. He was hunting for someone specific, not a badge name, not a job title, but a different word entirely. One this whole department was about to hear for the first time, and the only word in the building that meant anything to me at all. He said it once. Wraith. Not loud. Not a question, a flat statement. The voice of a man who already knew the answer and was only waiting for the room to catch up to him. Nobody moved. Nobody in that department had ever heard the word before, and for 3 full seconds, nobody understood it meant anything at all. I was standing against the supply room wall. The same door that never latched, with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since the radio call came through. I didn't look up. I didn't scan the room for whoever he might be talking about, because I already knew exactly who he meant. That was how he found me. Not my face, not my badge. The one person in a room of 30 who didn't turn to search for the source of the name. Reyes looked at me. I looked back. I pushed off the wall. I didn't run. I walked the way I used to walk toward a casualty collection point, unhurried, certain, like the floor itself had agreed to hold still under me. My spine straightened with every step, 2 years of careful smallness falling away one breath at a time. For the first time since I'd walked through Brookhaven's doors, I felt like myself. I went straight to the gurney, and the resident blocking my path stepped back before I said a single word, like something in my face had already rearranged the room's chain of command. "Move," I said. 1 syllable. My voice didn't rise. It dropped, flattened, settled into the register I hadn't used since Ramadi. He moved. Ashford started toward me. "Who do you think you are to? I'm not Wraith anymore," I said, not looking at him, already snapping on gloves. "But I still know how to do this. Get me a scalpel, a bougie, and a 6.0 tube." Now, nobody questioned the tone. Nobody could have, even trying. It carried the weight of every decision I'd ever made, with somebody's whole life sitting in my hands, and everyone in that bay felt it without understanding why. And then the room simply organized itself around me, the way rooms always had once. His airway was gone, swelling had closed everything above the cords, and there wasn't time left to try a tube the conventional way. I found the landmark by feel through the swelling, the soft notch between thyroid and cricoid cartilage. The same notch I'd located blind in worse light, with far less help than I had now. I made the incision horizontal, 1/2 inch, steady pressure, no hesitation. The way I'd been taught by a Navy doctor in a tent who didn't believe in second-guessing your own hands once you'd committed to the cut. I worked the bougie through the opening, felt for the tracheal rings under my fingertips to confirm placement, and then slid the tube over it in one motion. "Bag him," I said, and someone did, immediately, without question. His chest rose. His oxygen number, which had been crashing toward a place it doesn't come back from, started climbing instead. The bleeding from the facial lacerations was the next problem, fast and ugly, and I packed it with gauze and direct pressure while calling out numbers for the team to track. 60 seconds. I need a pressure check every 30. Reyes, a man who had once taken orders from me as a matter of course, and then spent 2 years not knowing where I'd gone, fell back into that rhythm instantly. No hesitation, no ego in the way. The 2 men behind him did the same. This was their brother on that gurney, and every one of them knew exactly what was at stake. Ashford stood at the edge of the bay, no longer giving instructions, no longer capable of giving any that mattered. Nobody in that room was looking at him anymore. My hands were perfectly steady. They had been since the moment I picked up the scalpel, the shaking gone the second there was finally something worth doing with them. And then, just briefly, I thought of the doctor in that tent outside Ramadi, who'd told me hesitation kills more people than wrong decisions ever do, and I cut the way he'd taught me. Because some lessons stay in your hands long after you've left everything else behind. The kid's oxygen held steady. His color started coming back. Reyes let out a breath he'd clearly been holding since the radio call. "There she is," he said, quiet, and nothing else needed saying. Once the patient was stable and moving towards surgery with a team finally equipped to handle him, Reyes turned to face the room. He didn't ask permission. He never had. "Hospital Corpsman First Class Marin Cole," he said, loud enough to reach every corner of that bay. "Call sign Wraith. Attached to 3 different platoons over 6 years because every one of them requested her by name. 8 men under her hands on a single deployment to Ramadi. 6 of them are still breathing today because of decisions she made faster than anyone I've ever served with, including the man standing behind me right now. She earned that call sign the hard way, and she never once asked anybody to remember it. Ashford's face did something I'd never once seen it do, the polish cracking, the color draining out from under his confidence, the particular stillness of a man recalculating every assumption his entire personality had been built on. Live. In front of a room full of witnesses. Wraith stepped back, came to attention, and saluted. The 2 men behind him followed half a beat later, gear shifting against their shoulders, the only sound in a department that had gone completely silent. I straightened my spine and returned it, the motion arriving in my body like it had never once left. A young resident by the door, the same one who'd knocked over the crash cart an hour earlier, stood frozen, staring like he was watching the entire night rewrite itself behind his eyes. He wasn't alone. The whole bay had gone still in the particular way a room goes still when it realizes exactly how badly it had misjudged someone, and there was nothing left to do about it now, except witness it. The charge nurse, who'd watched Ashford humiliate me twice that night without saying a single word, stood frozen by the desk with her hand pressed flat against her own chest. I didn't need her apology. I'd never been doing any of this for one. I didn't say anything else to Ashford. I didn't need to. The hospital board suspended his clinical privileges by the end of the week pending review, and not one person on that floor mourned it. I walked back to the supply closet and finished restocking what I'd abandoned 20 minutes earlier because the shelf was still half empty and somebody needed to fill it. Earl Whitlow, recovering 2 bays down from his own close call, caught my eye through the doorway and gave me a slow nod that said more than any speech could have managed. I nodded back. And then, for just a moment, the whole department seemed to exhale at once, the way a building does when it finally remembers how to breathe normally again. Reyes found me there for just a moment before his team left. "Come home," he said. Not an order, an invitation, the kind only a brother gets to make. I told him I'd think about it, and for the first time in 2 years, I actually meant it. And then he was gone, back into the night with his men, the same way he'd arrived, fast, certain, exactly who he'd always been. 2 years of carefully built smallness, and it turned out the only thing that had really changed that night was who finally noticed. The lights still buzzed the same tired pitch. The hallway still smelled like bleach and old coffee. Nothing about Brookhaven had changed at all, except, quietly, permanently, me. I finished the shelf. I went back to work. If this story stayed with you, hit like and share it with someone who still underestimates the quiet ones. Subscribe for more stories about people who carry more than the people around them ever bother to notice, the ones who served, who sacrificed, and who never once asked for the recognition they'd already earned. And drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this one travels tonight.